So it's with great pleasure at the invitation of Dr. Ananta Giri and Randir Gautam and the team that has put together the second memorial lecture of Chitta Ranjan Das, who, as Ananta G mentioned in the introductions, was very, very interested in land reform and wrote a book just before he died on what was the concept of Bu or Bhumi Satyagraha. So what is striking about Chitrabai's memorial is that he was interested, of course, in land reform and in alternative thinking. And this sets the stage for some of the work that we have been doing in Ekta, Parishad and Jagat over the years. So what I wanted to focus on in today's lecture, which I think is crucial, is how do we reduce economic inequality today in India? We are always in January fortunate to receive the Oxfam inequality report, which reminds us of the income gap. And this year, 2025, in 2025, the inequality report was takers, not makers, the unjust poverty and unearned wealth of colonialism. I think what was very striking about this inequality report, which led me to think that I needed to write an article, was that we're at a stage in India where income inequality has been surpassed. Excuse me. Income inequality has been surpassed by wealth inequality. And this is a startling fact that people are not based on income, but based on concentration of wealth, are further increasing the inequality between the rich and the poor. So when I heard this, I began thinking, what is it that we have been able to do within the Gandhian tradition for addressing economic inequality? And of course, we all know that when Chitrabai was writing about the Bhumi Satyagraha in Orissa, it was the same time that Vinoba Bhave, the follower of Gandhi, was doing his 14-year satyagraha around the country, collecting land for redistribution to the poor. And I always found it interesting that Vinoba was able to use karuna and not law, not force, not ideology, but a sense of appealing to each landlord that they should give 1/5 of their acreage to a poor family. So if they had 4 sons, they would imagine that their 5th son was the poor family, and it was out of love for their family, including this poor family, that they would give a portion of their land. This was carried on for 14 years, and it even continued past the time that Vinoba gave it up, with the land collection in Tamil Nadu by people like Jagannathan, we still have the great Gandhian Krishnamal Jagannathan, who is coming up, I think, next month to her 100th birth anniversary. And she continued almost to this day the use of karuna, or appeal to landlords, for gifting land to the poor as a strategy of land reform. So it was in this tradition that Ekta Parishad followed in their own work, which started in the 1990s. And I think what was becoming clearer at the time of the new economic reform process of 1991, when a form of structural adjustment was brought into India for the first time. And there was a liberalization and privatization of the economy. It was at that time that suddenly all of the land reform legislation that had been passed in 1950 by the Indian government in the first 5-year plan and taken by different states between the 1950s and 1980s. This time of the new economic reform process challenged deeply a land reform, because the challenge was, did the state have a right to distribute land, or should not land be now seen as a private commodity, and it should be seen as fundamental to the capitalist expansion that was desired in this new economic reform process. So let us say that the reason land reform was necessary is because at the time of independence, feudal land relations had then a huge gap between the rich and the poor. And it was understood that if nation building was going to take place, there needed to be transfer of land from the rich to the poor, from feudal landlords to the workers on the properties of feudal landlords, so that there would be a greater social, political, and economic equity that would be the basis of building a new independent India. And at the same time, there was land reform going on in China. There was land reform going on in South Korea, at that time, Korea. There was land reform going on in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in various parts of Southeast Asia, both capitalist countries and communist countries. And so India was following suit and saw this was important. So states, as is well known, different states, because land is a state subject, started to do their own land reform at different times in different ways. Most notably, Kerala's land reform started in the early 60s. West Bengal had the Operation Varga in the late 70s. So there was different states did land transfers in different ways in order to see greater social and political equity. But then as we came to this moment in 1991, when the new economic reform process started, it was clear that that was no longer the priority. The priority was to generate wealth through land transfer and private property, and not give or provide freely land to the poor. And because this now brought another layer on top of, there were feudal land relations up until then that were still operating, that land reform was trying to make more equitable. Now there was another layer of capitalism and capital, and seeing private property as a unit of that capital expansion. So resources, land became a resource. And, land in India has for millennia been seen as part of the clan and family, and, was seen as fundamental to the culture. But suddenly land was seen much more as an economic commodity that would be transferred and traded, and in as a part of the capital mode of production and so on. So what happened was government slightly withdrew their interest in land reform. And fortunately, Ekta Parishad, which was a social movement that had been slowly building from the grassroots in finding common alliances between different struggles. So from 1990 onward, they were identifying, particularly in the state of Madhya Pradesh, that was at that time Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh, trying to find how these struggles could be linked into a larger social movement. And what was becoming clear is many of these struggles was around land, where people who had land were becoming landless, or people and becoming wage laborers on other people's land. And they were losing this sense of their land and their identity to this new resource paradigm, that land was a resource, a natural resource. So Ekta Parishad began to respond to this. By 1996, they came up with this Jal Jungle Jameen, a kind of a mantra of land, forest, water as being the livelihood resources, the life and livelihood resources of the nature-dependent communities like the Adivasis and the small farmers, marginal farmers, and that needed to be protected, because if it was not protected, then so many people would be displaced. And of course, anyway, Adivasis had been displaced since independence because of the building of large dams and infrastructural development. There had been a loss of land, lots of loss of Adivasi lands. So by 96, it became clear to Ekta Parishad that a land reform program was necessary, that a land reform program in a Gandhian framework, building off Vinoba Bhave's Bhudan movement, needed to happen. And that was the only way that would enable land to stay with the poor and they would not lose it. And that those who had lost it should have lands given to them under the Land Reform Acts. So here you now have a social movement pushing on the state apparatus to follow through on the laws which they created, the land reform laws that they created, and to distribute land to the landless, or to regularize the lands of marginal and small farmers. And this went on, but it was a very big struggle because the government was now slowly moving to want to see corporate agriculture and greater industrialization. And for that, large tracts of land were needed, and large tracts of land above the ceiling were needed. And so many things developed. For instance, the special economic zones was an example of a mechanism that the state created from 2000 onwards to aggregate land for industry that would not have to follow the laws of the land, including land reform acts and ceilings. Because you may recall that the main aspect of land reform was there was a ceiling imposed on how much either irrigated land you could have or unirrigated land you could have. And so, it became very clear that if you could, I think it was in many states, 20 acres of irrigated land, 40 acres of unirrigated land, and above that, you had to give up that land so it could be redistributed. So Ekta Parishad tried to revive, after this structural adjustment, the new economic reform process, this time of turning land into a resource where now we have special economic zones, greater corporate agriculture. They wanted to remind the state that their laws still needed to be implemented around land reform in favor of the poor. And this was quite historic in and of itself. And I think the gap between the rich and the poor was large then, but it has become larger. So the ongoing issue of protecting the poor became more and more difficult. There were several pieces of legislation in 95 and around the Forest Rights Act, the revision of the Forest Rights Act of 1980. There was some legislation that was sort of helpful for Ekta Parishad to hold the line and allow Adivasis to help Adivasis keep their land. But it was really only after the drafting of the Forest Rights Act in 2005, and it was brought into law in 2006, that there was now a legal framework for the distribution of land in favor of indigenous communities, forest-dependent communities, which was one big segment of those people that Ekta Parishad, for whose rights Ekta Parishad was struggling. Now, the problem with the 2006 Forest Rights Act was there were no rules. So the Forest Department was a little cagey because they said, oh, yes, we have an act. But because there was no rules, there was no way to implement it. And it was after a very large action carried out by Ekta Parishad, walking with 25,000 people from Gwalior to Delhi, that they were able to bring in the rules. And then we started to see the redistribution of forest land to those Adivasis who could prove that up to December 2005, they were living on this piece of land, and that could then be regularized. Of course, they had to submit their application, all of their papers, and this was approved by a 3-tier system at the Gram Panchayat level, and Gram Panchayat and Panchayat level. So Ekta Parishad had its first big success with the Forest Rights Act, but there was also need for revenue land. So there was many other laws and policies that needed to be followed and fought in order for there to continue to be land reform for people to avail of land. And I think what was very interesting was that in 2012, when Ekta Parishad made a second grand march from Gwalior to Delhi, this time not 25,000 people, but 100,000 people, that they were then able to get the government to pass what was called the 10-point agenda. This was done by executive order. And these 10 points were basically the central government laying out a menu of different changes that were required by each state government's land policies for there to be sufficient redistribution of land to the poor. So these were two big moments of advocacy. And I would say we sit today looking at about, there was about 2.4 million, 2.5 million acres of forest land that has been distributed till date, till now. And there's been, that is individual pattas. There's been community pattas, there's been habitat pattas also being given under the Forest Rights Act, but there's been a lot of pressure by groups on the Revenue Department for distribution of revenue land, and in some cases turning common land into land pattas as well. So effectively what happened is there was a huge transfer of wealth via land from the government and some richer people to Adivasis and poor landless people. And this redistribution created a huge shift in the society, but the government was not anxious to see this. And unfortunately, even though the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, sits at the head of the Land Council, the Land Reform Council, he did not allow it to operate. It's just become moribund. However, these structures were there to enable the government to continue to redistribute land and to see it as a priority to the landless and marginalized communities of India. Now, you would say, I mean, how many people are really landless? By our estimation, in the rural areas of India, it still is hovering around 30%. So you can imagine when you live in a village and you don't have a piece of land, and you have to depend on either relatives, or you occupy land and do not have title, or you live in very marginalized areas, like on the side of tanks, which are public lands that cannot be given for private title, or you live on the side of roads or railway tracks. And this is why we still see a large number of people that have remained landless. There have been another set of programs that dealt with some of the landless, rural landless population in giving homesteads. And this was another very great step forward, giving 3 cents or 5 cents or 1/10 of an acre, whatever it is, sometimes even more, as homestead land for either Dalit communities or poor marginalized communities. So we do have some land distribution that has happened in that way. But for what we still see this is an ongoing way, an ongoing priority in the development of this country, because without land, people will be migrating. It is difficult for children to go to schools, to be settled. And it is just fundamental to a country's development. So for the country to still carry a huge landless, poor community is very difficult. So we still work and continue to work on this agenda. So how does that reduce income? And how does that create greater equality? Well, clearly, once you have a piece of land, you can work the land, and you have a capital asset. And this is extremely important. You can't, first of all, you don't have an identity in rural areas without a piece of land. It's like having an address for your Aadhaar card. Without an address, you're really a non-citizen. Without a piece of land, you're a non-citizen. So it is absolutely fundamental to the dignity and integrity and ability for advancement of any family to start with a piece of land. People in urban areas don't see that having a piece of land often is important, because many people rent an apartment and don't actually own. But in the rural areas, when land is your basic capital asset and you don't have a lot of money, this is absolutely essential. And so that was the first part of Ekta Parishad's history and continues. But we also understood that in order for marginalized communities to hold on to their land, it was necessary for them to generate different subsistence and other activities. And, whether it is food 3 months of the year to feed the family, or it is having some small cattle, or it is having a place from which you can lease other lands or use the forest resources available to you. This was very, very important for livelihood. So now what we have been really talking about, if I can sum it up before moving to the livelihood programs, is we're talking about a struggle in India between those people who depend on resources for their livelihood, for their life and livelihood, and those people who see resources to be exploited, monetized, and used in trade and in making money in business. And this struggle between those people that are the resource-dependent communities and those, say, the resource-extracting communities, there's been a huge conflict. And the role of Ekta Parishad has been to try to see not that the resource extractors don't get land, but that there's a fairness between those two big interest groups, that somehow the state should act as a kind of a referee and not picking the resource extractors side exclusively at the cost of the resource dependent group side. And so one of the very important laws that came up in 2013 was called LAR, the Land Acquisition Rehabilitation and Act, LAR. And under that act was very, very interesting. We had a lot to do with that act as well. It talked about what the government could expropriate as land, you see, because government has eminent domain. Government has control over all lands in India under the eminent domain, and it parses up that land by certain laws so that some does become private land. But much of the land is for industry is leased on 99-year leases. And so the government has the jurisdiction to acquire land. And land was acquired under the special economic zones. Land is acquired for national parks. Land is acquired for conservation area, for wildlife and conservation. So it acquires land. But in 2013, what LAR did, what this framework did that we helped to promote and push for, was to give the government some restrictions on what land they could expropriate and how they could expropriate it. So it was very important that the community agree that that land could be expropriated. And 80%, I believe, of the community had to agree for that land to be expropriated before it could be. And the zoning was important, and government could not just take agricultural land and expropriate it. So there were, under law, these restrictions, which were very, very important. These restrictions are still in place, but unfortunately, there's a bit of connivance in expropriating land by, sort of manufacturing consent rather than actually having genuine consent from the communities. However, nonetheless, this was a very important act. So a lot of Ekta Parishad's land work was to also delimit what could be expropriated so that there was still land available for redistribution, and for much of the land needed to just be regularized and restored to people. And then once that was done, they could look at redistributed land. Of course, India is a small landmass, and land is highly coveted by everybody, and families are often chopping up land into smaller and smaller pieces. So there is not land everywhere for redistribution, but what we have found is that if the government is able to provide large land tracts for developing, the production of food by a large food corporation, if they can provide land to, for extraction of coal, then of course they also have land that they can redistribute. So we're looking at a balancing of the resources, and not just a one-sided or lopsided development, which then puts us with a very large population of poor people, because once you are thrown into the landless category, it's a long climb up to get back and to develop. Okay, so this was fundamental for economic equalization, the transfer of land from the rich or from governments, forest areas, to the Adivasis, to the landless poor. And there has been a huge transfer and we welcome that as very, very important. But then the question is, the land that has been transferred needs to be kept in the hands of people who are poor, and therefore they need an economy which enables them to grow. Now, as we're all aware, much of our economic growth is seen by the organized sector in India, which is less than 10% of all production. There's a large unorganized sector and a small organized sector, which is really the industry, and the corporate agriculture is seen as the organized sector of the economy. It is small. Most of the people are still small in terms of the populace. And most people, 90% of the people, 90% plus, are still in the unorganized sector. Unorganized sector means small and marginal farmers, means artisans, and it means forest collectors, and all of those things which are not seen as part of the organized economy, which is creating the maximum economic growth for India. Now, I think this has to be contested to some extent, is how we see, and I think that's why we need a different framework. We need to look at things differently. That as we know, the large-scale sector in India is very, very important. But at the time of the COVID pandemic, for instance, when everything stopped, the wage laborers who were working in Delhi were suddenly without work. And without work, they can't feed themselves because we're in a hand-to-mouth relationship. And these wage laborers had to walk back, sometimes thousands of kilometers back to their villages, to stay during the course of the long pandemic that we suffered in India. And that really shows you that this is a violent system, because it doesn't give the wage earners a security, from which they can build their economy. And so we tend to see our mainstream economy in terms of our exports, in terms of, aggregate, revenue and tax, and how much taxes are being collected and so on, and how much money is being circulated. But we don't really appreciate the small-scale economies which are in the unorganized sector. And what I think is a good example is if you take just something like, a lot of the unorganized economy, by the way, is being run by women, small women's groups, self-help groups. There's also cooperatives. There's, farmer FPOs, farmer producer organizations. There are social enterprises. There's many entities that are operating, but largely, and I would say manned, but womaned by women. And so there's a great deal of economic activity that is going on. Now, we've been talking for years about women's reproductive activities, but what we haven't seen in India is that most people who are in the unorganized sector are doing 4 or 5 things at one time. They're not working on an assembly line and doing one thing from 9 to 5. They're rather doing some agriculture, but maybe they're doing weaving, and maybe seasonally they're doing some wage earning. And so there's a combination of money that they're acquiring from different activities. So it's a multitasking. It's not a single activity. And women are very actively engaged in this. So what is interesting, and if we draw attention to the fact that women's labor participation, if you look at the government statistics on women's labor participation and how much women are contributing to the economic growth in this country, a few years ago it was 22%. Now they're saying it's around 41%. So 41% of women's labor productive activities is feeding into the growth of India. But what is quite astonishing is that if you're in rural areas where 60+% of people live, you see that women are working 120% for their families. They're often doing handicrafts, or they're doing weaving, or they're doing agriculture, or they're also doing wage earning, and they're doing care activities. And so they're engaged. So it just seems like their labor participation is not properly represented. And that's because we don't really understand how all of these activities do contribute to our economy, because we tend to see economy in a very skewed way, based on the rich interests of the country and their economy, as opposed to the full Indian economy. And it was because of that we began to think, what is it that, what kind of framework can we elicit that people can easily understand at the grassroots level, to understand their economy as being important and legitimate. And then as we have been working in the tradition of Gandhi, and as many people know well, in that Gandhi's economist was J.C. Kumarappa, a Tamil, who is buried very close to where I'm staying here in Madurai, in T. Kalapati. And J.C. Kumarappa built the whole village industries concept that Gandhi was interested in building self.
Hello, we are not audible. Hello, Anantabhai, can you hear? I think Dr. Jill Carr-Harris is not there in the meeting. Some problem?
Yeah, I think there is network issue. Yeah,
I'm sorry,
Please tell.
yeah, I'm back. I'm sorry. I think the computer went down for a few minutes. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So I just say that Kumarappa was someone who brought a framework around this notion of economy of permanence. And he really mapped the idea that village industries had to work with the regenerative processes of nature. We'd say he was probably one of the first environmental economists and that was back in 1937. And out of his philosophy of village industries and
To happen. Okay. Thank you.
Ananta,
Yes.
should I continue?
Yes, please continue for another 5 minutes if it is okay, and then we would have discussion. Please, thank you.
Yeah. And so it was based on Kumarappa's idea of building village industries that we have taken this notion of social enterprise up in various parts of Ekta Parishad. We've looked at many social enterprises around the country, and we've seen that it's not just social enterprises to build a green economy, a sustainable economy. It's not just social enterprises to build more equality, but it's also to move us from a violent, exclusive, elitist economy to a more inclusive economy. And so there are many examples which we could show of how people who have got land are now trying to build social enterprises, but in a way that they're linking them so that they can become more visible as an emergent or a new economy. And I think this is really the two-step dance in reducing income inequality is the transfer of land and the building of businesses that are driving us towards a more a local economy and an economy that is more inclusive. So we feel, in conclusion, that this is anyway happening in India, and we just need to frame it and see it as emergent because this is where most women and most people in the unorganized sector are getting their sustenance and their livelihood and well-being. So I leave it at that. I hope that was understandable for our friends and listeners, and I welcome any comments. Thank you, Ananta.
Thank you so much, Jill Behan, for your deep and many-sided portrayal of the contemporary condition and struggles for alternative. What is so important is to lay down very important pathways of moving forward. For example, your very important distinction between resource extractors and resource dependent, and how there is a condition of fairness, and our institutions can always do better rather than being a one-sided perpetrator of one-sided violence. And I think the role of social movements is precisely to move along these directions. Along with that, the many-sided context of informal economy and also the kind of market realities that, once we give land. I have also visited the places in Brazil, where, MST and the land that is occupied, and how a new social economy is growing up, and also the question of ecological agriculture and the need for creative market linkage. That is very important because market is not just one kind of market. We need many kind of creative linking of the market, state, economy, and self also. In fact, Kumarappa's conception of economy is dependent upon an alternative conception of self, and how non-violent economy is also, therefore education is so important, because once we link economy and education, and then we can really educate ourselves to be far more self-dependent. rather than just dependent on market-based consumption. So we are grateful to you. Now I request both Ranadhir and Minati to co-nurture the discussion. It's, I am with the road. Thank you so much. Ranadhir and Minati, please.
Yeah, thank you, Anantavai. It was really very enriching session, and land reform is something very, very important for, last month I was writing a note on Chambal Shanti Mission, and there I found a very insightful imagination about, the eradication of structural violence through, surrendering, reconciliation, and rehabilitation. So land has also, been a very transformative source of land reform, particularly. So thank you so much, and I was very enriched with the presentation. So I think I have this much to say, but I want to understand how the cultivation, land distribution, because again, the question of property is very, very important. And, so far as the inequality is concerned, until unless we discuss the question of property, particularly the family property, in a very Gandhian way, then only we can have the equality in future. And so I request madam to please also request means reflect some more um, thinking about how this idea of trusteeship or the idea of land reform, it's how the volunteer transformation, volunteer participation of land reform can be, increased in society. Like she has also very deep experience of Chambal Shanti Mission, and it's a successful transformative movement. So if she can uh, uh, give some insightful experiences or praxeology from that movement, that would be helpful for me. Thank you.
You can invite one more attendant is there, no? Mr. Narayan Mahapatra, if he has to share some reflections or some queries, you can please unmute and share so that together we can just, put all the queries together, then she can answer. Mr. Narayan Mahapatra? Okay, as he's taking some time, I would just, I would like to, it was very insightful presentation by Dr. Jill Carr-Harris. So many-sided presentation. There is still, I have some, that general queries like, we know that why the land reform programs, many times face, that it is not successful because of the political things and the social situation and all. But I would like to know two queries I have. How do modern issues like, climate change, urbanization, and food security, it reshapes or the goals and the methods of land reforms? Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. This is what. And the second query is, what is the ethical imperative of land reform, and how does it intersect with the property rights and the social justice? These are the two queries I would just like to know. Thank you. You can just, thank you.
Respond, yeah. So I think that why we wanted to bring in this whole issue of nonviolent economy is because it also addresses the climate issue. For instance, in one area, Manatiji, we have 25,000 in Katni district. Katni and Damo district, which are two districts in the central part of India in Madhya Pradesh. Those people who receive lands are now doing chemical-free agriculture. There are 25,000 that we're working with in two districts in the Ekta Parishad family of organizations. And those 25,000 farmers, most of whom are women, by the way, they are getting land and cultivating that land and bringing in, or slowly organic, moving towards chemical-free to organic, because they see not only the value addition to that, different kinds of millets and, and so on, but they also see it as a sustainable practice because they themselves are suffering as farmers in the cycle of droughts and floods and so on. So there is an ability with the communities that have come together and got land to redirect them into a more sustainable farming practice and create their livelihood accordingly, rather than following the industrial model of agriculture on a small scale. I think there's also the whole, if you look at all the various social enterprises that we're engaging with, a large number of them are in helping to make more fair the agricultural production to markets, because a farmer produces and then there's agro processing that goes on, and then they look for ways of getting to direct markets so the middleman is not taking the giant share of the money, and so that people can be, as you can appreciate, producers can get a higher wage, and therefore they're in a better situation in terms of their food security. I think what we're really trying to do in the nonviolent economy, which is placed on top of this land reform, is we're trying to see how do we bring particularly these women's groups, cooperatives, FPOs, up above subsistence, right? So that they can work in groups, they can be in land trusts, they can be where they share tractors and common facilities, right? And they are able to also gain more as producers because they can manage the value chain more effectively. So this is why this is so important in a situation with so much food insecurity, so much economic inequality, and on top of that, the climate crisis. These we see as really the ways forward. Yeah. There's a paper that has been written behind this, which I'd be happy to send to you, which I was not, I think, adequately able to completely convey. So I'm happy to share that with you as well.
Okay, thank you. Professor Kanluiji, would you like to share something? You joined now. Or Ananta bhai, some closing words from you?
So again, it has been a beautiful journey, and again, we are grateful to Jill Behan, and especially the theme of land, how important it is, and how land is the connecting point, for example, between base and consciousness, and dream and imagination, like Minoti, you were writing of the poetic, how the poetic and the land are connected together. In fact, some of the beautiful songs that emerge when landless people have land. Chittavai, in his glimpses to Odia literature, in one place he mentioned that what we call as the very, you know, uh, golden moment in Odisha or India, we see that at that time people have limited access to land. So how can we discuss excellence in literature and culture without looking into the basic condition of people like land and ownership? So therefore, it is very befitting that we could have a discussion on this on our second Chitta Ranjan Das annual memorial lecture. And thank you again, Jill Ben and all friends. And now with you, Minati, please.
Hello. Yeah, I would just like to remind Dr. Jill, I met you around, I think in 2017. You would not be remembering that. That was a short film festival beyond the borders in 2017. Professor Meera Chakravarti, Sudhadi, and I joined that film festival, and we have a group photo also. But I was never, I had not interacted with you like I'm directly interacting with you now.
Thank you
So,
for reminding.
so that,
Yeah.
so I thought just, I mean, that photo is there still with me. So I just, last time something happened, we could not meet, that webinar got cancelled. So I thought this time I'll remind you. You may not be remember that. I remember clearly that was the Beyond the Borders, the name of the theme of the short. All a group of people were showcasing the short film.
Yes.
So Anandabhai, can we close now?
Yes, please. And if possible, with a poem from you.
This poem I have written in Odia when we are telling about that land and this thing that I have written in Odia. So whether that I will, okay, I will read it and just,
Yes, please.
tell the meaning in English like that. We can do that. Okay. Just a minute. Sorry, I'm taking. Actually, the title of the poem is, I think, this title of the poem is Jungle and Dadan. I hope Dr. Jill understands these two terminology. Like it is the forest and the Dadan. No, the people go for the labor. So that is the this thing. So I'm just reading. I'll tell the gist. ଏସନ ଶୀତ ଋତୁରେ ଘର ଅଗଣାରେ ଗୁଞ୍ଜିବ ପାଉଁଜିର ଝମଝମ ଶବ୍ଦ। ସକାଳର କଅଁଳିଆ ଖରା ଛୁଇଁ ଯାଉଥିଲା ଗୁରୁବାରର ଦେହ ମନ ଆଉ ଅଗଣା। So this says in this winter there will be, sunlight in the veranda of our house, and the sound of the tinklets, the ankle sound will be there. ଖରା କାକରକୁ ପିଠି କରି ଲୁହ ଲହୁକୁ ଏକା କରି ବଢ଼େଇଥିବା ଦୟାକୁ କରିଦେବ ହାତକୁ ଦିହାତ। Despite of all these years, she will get married her son. So ଦାଦନ ଜୀବନୀ ଆଉ ଏକଇର ବଳା ବିଶିକେଶନ ନିତ ଚୁଲି ଜଳେଇବାଟା ଗରିବ କୁଡ଼ିଆରେ କେଉଁ ଏକ ବିଳାସରୁ କମ୍ ଯେ she is expecting that her son will not go for the bonded labor, and that every day if there is fire in your chulha, in your cooking place, that is a luxury for a poor person. So that is what ଛାତିରେ ପଥର ରଖି କଟାଇଛି ଦିନ। ଛିଡ଼ା ହୋଇଛି ଲୁହାର ପାଚେରୀ ପରି ଶୁକ୍ଳ ପକ୍ଷର ଜହ୍ନ ଭଳି ନୀତି ବଢ଼ାଇଛି ଜମାପୁଞ୍ଜି ତାହାରି। She says that with a lot of difficulty she has grown her boy, and little she has accumulated few some wealth to get him married and to improve the economy of the house. ଗର୍ଭଣୀ ଗାଈଟେ ଆଉ ଛେଳି 3-4, ଭାଗ ଚାଷ କମ୍ ଖାଇ ବେଶୀ ଦଳି ଦିଅନ୍ତି ହାତୀ। ତାଙ୍କ ସହ ଚାଲିଛି ସାଲିସରେ ହିଁ ତ ଜୀବନ। She says that she has one pregnant cow and 3-4 goats, and that she doesn't have land, and she she takes land for what you say, that they do the cultivation for other people. They hire that they rent that land to just so she, and from that also she does not get everything, because the elephants, they eat less and they destroy more. So she doesn't want to fight with them, because they are coexisting with them, so they will be there. So that is she has taken, life will be like that. But so one day suddenly what happens, in the morning she finds in her cow shed all the means goats, they are dead, and the pregnant cow, she is also dead. So that means all her what you say, dreams, and all her hopes all shatters, because she has to send her only son again for the bonding labor. This is what the theme of the poem. So this the last stanza I will read. ତାଙ୍କ ସହ ସାଲିସରେ ହିଁ ତ ଜୀବନ ଚାଲିଛି, ଛକା ପଞ୍ଜା ସାଥେ ବଞ୍ଚିବା ହିଁ ଜୀବନ, କେମିତି ବା କରନ୍ତି ବୈରୀ। ସେଦିନ ସକାଳ ନିଶବ୍ଦ ଗୁହାଳରେ ମରି ପଡ଼ିଥିଲେ ସବୁ ସ୍ୱପ୍ନ ଓ ଆଶା, ଗାୟବ ଥିଲା ଗୁରୁବାରୀର ସମସ୍ତ ଭରସା। ଜଙ୍ଗଲ ବିଭାଗ ବାବୁ ତନଖୁଥିଲେ ପାଦ ଚିହ୍ନ, କେଇଦିନ ତଳେ ହାତୀ ସିନା ଭାଙ୍ଗି ଦେଇଥିଲା ଫାଳେ ବଖରା, ତଥାପି ଭାଙ୍ଗି ପାରିନଥିଲା ସାହସ। ଆଗାମୀ ଚିନ୍ତା ଓ ଆଶଙ୍କାରେ ଘିରି ଘିରି ବୁଲୁଥିଲା ଗୁରୁବାରର ମଥା, ଆଉ ଥରେ ପୁଣି ଦାଦନ। So I hope you got the gist of the poem, because it is I have other English poems, but this